Welcome to Australian Hiker, your online hiking resource. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 141 of the Australian Hiker podcast. And in today's episode, we're catching up with Lucy Barnard from Tangles and Tail as she makes her way north from the bottom of South America to the top of North America on an epic 30,000 kilometre journey. In today's episode, Lucy is currently in Ecuador, and very shortly she's just about to make her way into Colombia, which will be the last trip on the South American leg of her journey. We hope you enjoy. So, Lucy, welcome back to the Australian Hiker podcast.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. So since we last talked to you, which was towards, I think it was around about October 2019, so it's been a while, tell us where you have come to over the last sort of 4 months.
Yep. After speaking with you, I arrived at the border of Ecuador and I followed a trail all the way through Ecuador called the Trans-Ecuador Single Track Trail. And it's called that because there are two trails that have been designed to go through Ecuador for cyclists, and there's one that's for regular cyclists, and then there is another one which I've now come to know quite intimately, and I think that if you're a cyclist and you use that trail, you would be completely out of your mind, because for me as a hiker, it was really difficult. The altitudes were high, and there are just some areas where you would be carrying your bike for days. It was just beautiful, but at times impossible and just torturous.
So it sounds like it's more a hiking trail that bikes are allowed to use rather than the other way around.
Definitely. And actually I got to meet the boys who designed those trails, and they said that they expect completely that that's what that second trail will become, a hiking trail for people that want to through hike Ecuador, because there's not enough cyclists using it to start with, and there are some areas where you really do get stuck with your bike, especially in some areas where you drop into valleys and you have to climb back out again, and they become so overgrown so quickly with the amount of rainfall here that it can really break the spirit of a cyclist.
Well, I suppose if you're that enthusiastic, you'll probably find a way, but it's probably a hard thing to try and do.
Oh, believe you me, I had several tantrums going through some of those sections, and my spirit was nearly broken on several occasions, just on very long days when I should have just set up my tent when I'd seen the perfect places.
It's a hard thing, isn't it? You sort of walk past a perfect spot and thinking, I've still got a couple of hours to go, and you never find anything as good as that one particular site.
Yeah, and the problem for me is that I'm always worried about running out of food, and I never have. Well, I haven't for a very long time now. And I think that sometimes I should just stop at those nice places and arrive into town late. But I'm obsessed with getting into town early because it's safer, and I don't necessarily want to have to find accommodation in town. I want to get through those towns and find the next spot to set up camp. And, of course, every time you finish a day short adds up, and when I'm walking against visas, that can be a problem. Like, it can become a problem that's just too hard for me to solve. I don't want to have to end up leaving a country and coming back and starting up the expedition again in a year's time.
Now, speaking of visas, I think the last time we talked you said that you were coming to the end of your visa as you were leaving Peru. I'm guessing you managed to get out of Peru at the right time, did you? Or?
You know, that turned out to be quite a story, because I did. I got to the border and it was a really nice place, and the police and customs were really kind to me, and they let me stay there for a couple of nights just in my tent. And I am always concerned, or I just like to have a bit of cushioning room so that if I have any troubles getting Wombat across the border, that I can go back and see a vet or do whatever is required to get a dog across to the next country. Yep. So I crossed into the next country, and there was no problem at all. Like, they didn't even look at him. They just stamped me through, and I continued on my way. But that day, the riots in Ecuador began, and they shut the borders in a few hours after I crossed. But I crossed really early in the morning. And so had I not crossed that day, I could have ended up in a situation where I'd overstayed, even though there was a political issue with getting across the border. But I was not aware of it at all until I reached the first major town called Vilcabamba. And then I met some friends there, and the riots were beginning to really pick up. And there was worries about food shortage and being able to access money. But where I was, I mean, they were worried, but it was really minimally impacted. And I had a nice time spending time with a friend who I had met and had been in contact via email up until that point. But I only had $3 because I didn't have any American dollars on me. I only had Peruvian sols. And so because I couldn't get money out of the banks, I ended up living on bread. And there in the south of Ecuador, there are many, many banana trees. So I just ate bananas and bread for a couple of days until I could get money out of the bank.
Yeah, it's funny with South America. The bigger cities, you've got an ATM and you just turn up and everything works well. But as you say, if you're in a situation where you don't or can't access the banks because for whatever reason, it's a bit hard to try and actually find money.
Yeah, it really can be. But I mean, ultimately I got through Peru without having any troubles with my visa. And then I had just under 3 months again to get through Ecuador because I had visited on a previous break with my mum. So I had to walk a little bit faster. And those 10 days that I spent in Vilcabamba in that first town was eating out of precious hiking time and resting time. So again, I had this looming worry about my visa. And in fact, I finished Ecuador with a week to spare. But by the time I finished the trail, I had built up a fair few amoebas in my system, and it had just gotten to the point where it was overtaking my body. So the last night of my hike, I spent in an abandoned house, which they just seem to appear at the most perfect times. But I spent the whole night vomiting. It was a complete mess. And I had this terrible taste in my mouth, like a metallic taste, which is apparently a typical symptom.
Yep.
And it made me want to be even sicker. So I limped in to Tulcan, the final town. And I'd told some friends that I'd met in Quito that I was in this situation. And so they said, get on a bus and come and stay with us for a few days, and we'll just sort your visa out for you when you get here. So I arrived in town. This is going to get a bit gross. But I got on the bus with Wombat. I got back into Quito, and I went to a doctor, and I ended up doing about 3 or 4 courses of antibiotics. But the problem was I'd had food poisoning, so they treated me for that first. Then the amoebas turned up. They treated me for that. Then they found that I had trench foot, so I needed treatment for that. And then I just kept getting waves of this terrible stomach bloat, which again needed treatment. And the next day I was feeling a little bit better, so I went to wash all my clothes. And if you've ever gone hiking for an extended period of time, which you have, you'll know that usually the shock of the smell of your clothes is, interesting to say the least.
Yep.
But because I'd been so sick, I mean, it nearly set me off all over again. I don't know how the people on the bus dealt with me being on the bus because I was just in a terrible, terrible, terrible state.
Yeah, I think that's often the thing. I think if you're going for short hikes, a day or two for most people, even if you do feel unwell, you can cope with it. But when you're doing what you're doing, it's a bit hard to say, well, I'll just go home for a few months and have a rest. You're there, you're in an environment where your food's changing on a regular basis. And I must admit, the food in South America tends to be very erratic. I found that the Peruvian food didn't particularly agree with me that much. I
haven't had too many troubles, especially because I do get to these little towns, or at least I thought that I didn't have too many troubles. So I get through these towns, I eat the local food, I go straight to these mercados, which are like a place where you can buy meat, veg, and your fruits. And I typically, and a lot of people won't even touch that food, but I mean, that's the choice that I have. But what I have come to learn is that people here tend to deworm themselves every 6 months, and that's just a normal process here. It's what you do because you are exposed to contaminated water and food. That's just the way it is. So I hadn't been doing that, and the chemist was quite surprised that I haven't been dewormed for, well, since I was a child.
Yeah. I must admit, if we go overseas, or even if I do a long through hike in Australia, I'll deworm myself at the end of the trip, just as a matter of precaution.
It's such a strange concept to me. Even now, I'm not used to it, but I will start doing that now that I've learnt. And the people here in Ecuador have been really kind to me. And again, I got into keto, and as I said, I only had a week left on my visa. So in the end, I was ill and I went into immigration, and there's a special line for people that just want to extend their holiday visas, and it's just, like less than an hour process.
Yeah.
But I was too unwell to go around running to the bank and paying for the extension and blah, blah, blah. So they told me I had a month's grace period and that I could just come back when I was ready to extend it, but I couldn't leave the country because once that visa expired, if you try and leave, then you do get into trouble without the extension.
Yeah. So one way or the other, they get the extension fee out of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they were really like the staff at immigration were really good. They could see that I was under the weather, so they walked me from one place to the next, knowing that my Spanish also wasn't that good, and just really took care of me. So it was, and that's been a theme running throughout the whole of my walk. There's always someone there ready to help you when you need it.
That sounds good. All right, so tell us about hiking in Ecuador.
Oh, it's definitely my favourite country so far for the hiking. And I think probably because there's this trail that runs the whole way through the country. And it starts off where I've gone from being in Peru with these open grassy fields, moving straight across a river and into jungle where there are lots of bananas and strange sounds and more animals I haven't heard for a really long time. It's nice to have that presence of life nearby. But what also came with moving into the jungle, of course, is the rain. So I was getting rained on after lunch pretty much every day. But at the same time, it's just so beautiful, and you can forgive the rain because it's just so stimulating walking through such a beautiful country. So I popped into this first town, and then I walked up into some mountains following an Incan trail, because those trails run all the way up to Colombia in parts, but the further north you go, the harder they are to find. So I came across some beautiful ruins that not many people get to see because they are so remote. And then from there I started crossing into volcano country. So just imagine, I mean, one of the biggest, well, the largest volcano in South America is Chimborazo, and it's covered with snow. It's beautiful. It's the closest point on Earth to the sun. But because of the weather, I didn't see it while I was walking past it because I was just in fog the whole time.
Yeah, it's good when you do hikes like that, isn't it? There's something there, you just can't pick it up.
Well, you know what? I got out of the valley and I looked behind me and I got to see a view of it then, which I was really pleased to do because I was cranky all day that I hadn't seen it. And then I continued north, and the country just continued being as spectacular. And the next very famous volcano I passed, called Cotopaxi, was out in its full glory the days that I walked past. There was no clouds. It was just beautiful. I got some great photos. And after I passed through that region, I went through the final stretch, which becomes jungly again. And there was one section where I could hear monkeys. It was really cool.
Okay, so I think before you mentioned when you were just about to enter Ecuador that there are some fairly high mountains there as well. Yep. So I spent most of my time above 3,000 meters, which is quite manageable. And then once you get above 3,500, you really start to feel the altitude, especially if you haven't had much experience with altitude climbing. And so once I'm heading towards that 4,000 meter mark, that's really when I slow down and I notice that I'm doing only about 2 kilometers an hour.
The trade-off, of course, is that it's really beautiful and you don't mind so much. But when you're walking along old trails or horse trails or these mud tracks that are just full of fresh rain and slippery, the days can be long.
What do you call long? What time are you starting and what time are you finishing?
I like to start at first light. I mean, when you're on these trails, you have to be able to see because you're navigating and the trails aren't always obvious. So let's say I'd start walking at about 6 o'clock or 6:30, and then I would finish at around 6 p.m. So a 12-hour walking day with maybe half an hour rest. If I was in a stretch where the distance between towns was long and I was worried about food.
So have you gotten rid of the extreme heat, or is it you've now shifted to just hot and humid?
Yeah, there were a couple of places that were quite hot. It's definitely dropping into the beginning of Ecuador was very hot, but once you're in the mountains, it's cool unless it's not raining and there's no cloud cover, and then it can get just really, really uncomfortable. So I have. And when I continue, I have 2 mountain ranges left, so two crossings at about 4,000 meters, so think quite cold. But once I drop out of those again, it's going to be challenging this year, particularly because I'm going to be spending a lot of time in the heat.
So your next stop after leaving Ecuador is Colombia. And looking at the online map, there seems to be a couple of options. You can either take the long route or the short route. So how long is it going to take you to get through Colombia?
Yeah, well, there's a famous bike trail, but it's 4,000 meters, and I don't need to go that far through Colombia. My trail is about 1,300, and so I should be there I should be at the end of Colombia by mid to late May.
Okay, sorry. When you say meters, is that altitude or you mean kilometres?
Did I say meters? Sorry. Yes, 1,300 kilometres.
I think that's a short walk.
Yeah, totally. Got through that in no time.
Now, what are the worries with Colombia? And I know I've never been to Colombia, but everything I read, everything I hear, from a security point of view, Colombia seems to be the country that most people worry about. Is that the case?
It does, doesn't it? Look, I've spoken to some people that live there and have adventured through there, and they say that, yeah, there are some risks, but that it's nothing like what people will tell you that it's like, especially because, I mean, there is some there's history there, and it used to be a pretty high-risk country and now not so much. But actually, I'm really looking forward to it now because I've had a lot of people say to me, no, I know a lot of people are trashing Colombia, but actually the people are really nice here, and you're probably going to like it more than any other country you've been in so far. So having heard that now from fellow female travellers and male travellers alike, I'm really getting excited to get into there.
Now, before we started this interview, you were saying you're going to have a lot of road walking in Colombia?
Yeah. Yeah, it's all road. I think it's going to be all road until the United States.
Yeah, I suppose there's as the countries start narrowing a bit, there's probably not 3 or 4 different routes you can choose from. There's probably a route that most people tend to do.
Yeah, and I'll take advice like I usually do from off-road cyclists. They're usually the ones that have the best information. But otherwise, yeah, I can't really see security-wise as well. It's just better to be on the roads instead of in the mountains from here on out. And so that means I'll be looking at 1.5 years of walking along roads. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be ugly highways. I have a trail through Mexico, for example, that's going to be really beautiful, and it's following the countryside, and it's going to be kind of remote like I enjoy. But it's just a different style of walking, and it'll be difficult, I think, mostly because Wombat will have to be on a lead and he likes to be free.
Is that just from a point of view of that he doesn't get himself run over, or?
Exactly. Yeah, I have to be quite careful. And I mean, if I'm walking and I can see that it's quiet and there's not many cars coming past, then I do let him off. But I just can't afford to risk him having one moment of distraction and making a silly error and getting himself really hurt.
So how is Wombat going?
No, really good. He's a bit bored right now because I've been on an extended break. I take a break like this once a year to get my logistics sorted. But he does have some friends here, some dog friends that he's been playing with, and my friends that I'm staying with are high energy, dog loving people, so they are happy to play tug of war with him and help me to tire him out.
So I believe you or he has picked up a friend over the last few weeks.
Yeah, so I've been doing some Spanish, like an intensive Spanish course to help me get better at Spanish while I'm on a rest. And that means I have to go up to bus stop and then catch a bus into town each day to go to class. And one morning, a dog, I'm catching a bus at 5 a.m. and there's this dog sitting there at the bus stop looking miserable. And I just gave him a little pat on the chin. And then it seems that he waited for me to get home and followed me home. And he was starving. I mean, he's been here now for about 2 weeks and he's put on a lot of weight, and he's very opportunistic about food, and he'll push the dogs out of the way, but he's getting better now and he's looking much healthier.
Is that him in the background there, or?
No, that sounds like Wombat. That's the bark he makes when the other dogs don't want to play with him, and he just keeps going at them until they give in and play.
All right. Now, you mentioned to me before we started talking that you're looking at some stage sending Wombat back home. Is that the case?
Well, when I finish, I want him to come home with me. So, but that's not just a matter of arriving to Alaska and jumping him on the plane with me. To come back into Australia, there are quite a number of rules and regulations that you need to follow, and one of the most obvious ones being anti-rabies precautions. So for any dog coming into Australia that is not in a rabies-free zone, you need to have their bloods checked, and it's a 6-month process of making sure that there isn't any residual rabies traces within their blood system, and then you've got to continue giving them the anti-rabies vax. And once that starts to be processed 6 months beforehand, then you need to apply for a permit. So if you miss your deadlines, it can mean that you're ending up waiting in your final destination for up to 6 months before you can come home with your dog, and you have to travel with the dog.
Yeah, I must admit, if for most people you tend not to think of the logistics of travelling with a dog, you think about your own visas and passports and airplane tickets, but having an animal of some sort tends to complicate things a bit more.
Yeah, it does. And also, I mean, they need to sit in customs for or quarantine for 10 days, and that needs to be booked in. So there's a lot of moving parts, and if you neglect one of them, I mean, the error is going to cause significant time delays.
Yeah. All right. So what were the highlights for you over the last 4 months?
Definitely walking through areas where there are wildlife. That was really exciting for me because I've always been an animal lover. And passing through volcanoes is a real wow in terms of scenery. But then there were just little things that happened this year. So I arrived late after going the wrong way and getting lost into a little town. And I was standing in a bread shop, and these people walked in, and one of them said, "Are you Tangles?" And it was just really exhilarating to have them so excited to run into me, because I am always off the grid, and it isn't likely that people are going to see me unless they are hiking in these remote places as well. So that was really fun. And then another thing that happened like that this year was that there's a mum who's been following me for some time, and she dobbed her son in to bring me a lot of stuff. And so meeting him was really exciting too, because it's nice to meet people from back home, but also at that point I had sole blisters on my feet that were the same size of my feet. You know, they ran all the way along because my shoes were waterlogged and my feet had just been wet for days and days in a row because I didn't have dry socks and I couldn't get my shoes dry. So I think those moments of running into people and just really feeling the love really re-energized me this year.
Yeah.
Oh, and also, I can't believe I've not mentioned this. I crossed the equator, so that was really exciting. So now I'm in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, where does the equator goes through Ecuador? Does it or?
It does. It's just north of Quito. So I mean, it's not halfway in terms of the kilometers of getting all the way up to Alaska, but who cares? That's a big milestone, and I think that marks me as the first woman to have walked the length of the southern hemisphere.
Oh, congratulations!
Thanks.
Okay, so from a long-term point of view, you're going to be spending roughly about 3 months getting through Colombia?
Yeah, so it's actually a bit easier to extend your visa in Colombia, but the aim is 3 months. If I can get away with not extending, I will. I'll keep pushing through, especially because once your legs are warmed up, I've been stopped for about 10 weeks now, and I know that there will be consequences on my body, and I'm going to have to build up on some of my muscles that give my knee grief if I don't. And once you get into that walking rhythm, cutting off your rhythm is not ideal, because then you have to go through all of those teething problems again. So I'll push right through till about July, when my cousins are going to come and meet me in Costa Rica.
All right. And you're aiming at Mexico City by the end of 2020?
Yeah, I want to be there for Christmas. I mean, I've always wanted to see Mexico City. I am excited about the colours and the customs for Christmas. So if I can be there by the end of the year, I'll be really happy. But more than anything else, that timeline will get me to the United States just in time for the perfect season of hiking the Pacific Crest Trail.
I was thinking that was about right, because I mean, really, you want to sort of start.
I didn't do that on purpose; it just happened. And then that means that I will also arrive in Alaska in summer, which is nice, but I can't finish that final leg until winter, once the oceans freeze over and when all the bears are asleep.
Yeah, you start getting different problems up there, don't you?
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Just these things that you never think of, deworming yourself, being eaten by an anaconda, not something that goes through your head living the day-to-day life in Australia.
All right. So any last thoughts before we finish off for the interview?
No, I just think that it'll be really interesting to see how I go this year. I've really started to pick up my kilometres over the last year, and I've gotten a lot better at goal setting. So I think this year can either be really, really great, or I guess there could be some hold-ups, but I am really excited for the year, and I'm just pleased to be still out here.
That's good. Yeah, it's pretty unique, and it's good to be able to follow along and see how you're going.
Yeah.
So we've been talking to Lucy Barnard, who is progressing her trip from the bottom of South America to the top of North America. Thanks for your time, Lucy.
Thanks for having me.
So that was our recent catch-up with Lucy from Tangles and Tail. And as we are talking to her, she is only about a week or two from starting her journey back up again. So we just wanted to talk about some of the stuff that Lucy went over on this leg of the trip, which was through Ecuador. And it was interesting. I knew there was a large trail that went through Ecuador, but didn't know what it was. And she was talking about the Trans-Ecuador single-track trail. And I've got a link to that in the show notes on our website for that, for those that are interested.
And the photo of the cyclist carrying his bicycle.
Yeah, so the front page of the website is got, as Jill said, a photo of a guy carrying his bicycle across a log over a small stream. So it's, as she said, it's probably one of those hikes or one of those walks that, even though it's a cycle trail, is probably more suited to hikers. And I know I've heard from and talked to a lot of hikers who have done this trip, and it seems to be gaining popularity. One of the things that Lucy talked about was when to stop for the day. And this is a topic that I've been working on over the last few weeks, and we'll look at it for either a podcast or a written article for the website. For a lot of people, you stop at a planned campsite, and if there's a designated stopping point, that makes it easy. But in this case here, where you've got a much larger journey planned, or there's no designated campsite, you start thinking about, well, do I stop in town? Do I stop outside of town? And Lucy obviously has a list of criteria that she looks at. But as she said, sometimes it's like, maybe I should have stopped before town. And unfortunately, it comes down to hindsight. You really don't know in a lot of cases that, the best campsite was 10 kilometres ago. And I've had campsites like that where I've stopped and gotten up the next morning and 200 metres on was a brilliant campsite.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that until the next day. So it's an interesting concept to go through and think about.
Yeah, and I think because she's also wanting to catch the food, she mentioned that she powers on into the town so that she can make sure that she can pick up her food and do that sort of stuff. That probably drives her, I suspect, much more than we would realise or appreciate. And it's not as if you can, go down the local takeaway or you've got a short trip in a car or something like that to restock and refuel. So I was interested when, she was talking at the end about the journey and when she was going to get to certain places. And it does appear that she does a lot of planning, but she's assuring us that that's not the case. There must be some, but, yeah.
She talked about visas, and again, it's usually something that if you're going to a country overseas, quite often you think about you might need a visa to get into the country. So if you're going to the USA, as an example, you might need a tourist visa. But when you're dealing with something that's going to take 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the whole concept of visas becomes a lot more critical. And she was talking about moving into from Peru into Ecuador and having the issue of the riots. And I had a look at what the riots were, and it was there were riots over the austerity measures. And all of a sudden that can potentially close the border. And she was lucky that she got through on time. Otherwise, she would have ended up overstaying where she was. So it's something you tend not to think about. You just think, well, I'll just get a visa and not worry about it. But sometimes, particularly in South America, having riots, having protests is not unusual, particularly for austerity measures. So it's something you need to consider. She talked about accessing money, and when we travelled through South America, you just go to an ATM, put your card in like you do here in Australia. But in the case of when there are riots, and the ATMs aren't working or they've been cleaned out or the banks are closed, sometimes you've got to try and factor that in. So she said she ended up living off bananas and bread for about 3 or 4 days because she had no money. Sometimes you just need to have that bit of backup dollars-wise, or else be happy with eating
bananas and bread.
Bananas and bread. One of the things she mentioned, and it was interesting to hear, was about getting ill on the trail. And, as she said, this was probably more detail than you really needed to know.
I didn't need to know about the trench foot.
But given the length of the trip she's doing and the fact she's in countries where the sanitation may not be as good, or the fact that she's hiking and sleeping outdoors for long periods. As I said, if I'm doing a through hike, as a matter of course, I do worm myself when I come back, just as a precaution. I have had Giardia in the past, which is one of the amoebas.
Yes, we know, Tim.
So it's the sort of thing that, it sounded like everything seemed to hit her at once. She had a combination of worms, amoebas, trench foot, and everything and anything. So she went through a period where she really wasn't very well.
Yeah, and I think if you think about yourself and how many times you get a bit of a cold and a sniffle in a year, I mean, she's out there for a long period of time, doing it pretty tough. So you probably don't think about getting sick, but there'd be days when, she might not even be impacted by the worms, the amoeba and the trench foot, but she just might feel, a bit ordinary, a bit under the weather, and she's got to keep going. So that's the sign of a real, a tough spirit and a real athlete.
So she talked about hiking in Ecuador in general, and the thing that she sort of stood out was the changes in vegetation from open grasslands to forest or jungle that had monkeys in it. And again, I don't know what it is. I know there are monkeys in South America, and you think of the Amazon, but when you think of Ecuador and places like that, you tend not to associate it with being jungle.
I do.
Yeah, I mean,
I do.
I suppose I tend to think about it being more about the mountains, which certainly the altitude is there. So it's just one of those things that you have in your mind, and it's when she talks about this. I was actually reading an article on Ecuador yesterday, just after I'd talked to Lucy, and it was talking about the fact that there are at least 80 hippopotamus in Ecuador rivers, thanks to Pablo Escobar, the drug lord, who when he was caught and collected, all the animals got turned loose. So again, hippopotamus in South America, they're there.
Yeah, hopefully she doesn't see one of those. I liked hearing about the Inca trails and the ruins that she came across. There probably wouldn't be too many people who would have experienced that. So that's kind of interesting. I also, Lucy just has this joy about her, and when people came up to her and said, are you Tangles? She just doesn't think of the impact, I think, that she's having, and the people that are following her, and she obviously enjoys hearing about it and enjoys that there are people out there who are following and supporting her. But it just seems like a surprise for her. It's just like, oh yes.
She talked about the volcanoes. She talked about being much of the walk in Ecuador being above 3,500 metres. And that's, for me, once I start getting over that, I'm a bit like her. You just tend to lose, you just tend to lose that energy, I suppose.
Well, even at 4,000 metres, and she's, travelling long distances and 12-hour days, that's pretty serious going.
And then she talked about what a typical day was like. And again, for people doing long-distance hikes, you do get into a routine and you do get into a rhythm. And she mentioned a bit later on that the process of stopping and starting, so she's in Ecuador dealing with all the logistics before she starts off again fairly shortly. And there's always a lot of logistics. It's like organising new gear, organising transport. And in the case of Wombat, she was talking about organising the requirements for him to come back to Australia. That's probably not going to be for at least a year, but she's having to think about those sort of things now, just because it's such a long process for the blood tests and to make sure he hasn't got rabies and everything else that she's got to go through, and she can't leave that to the last minute. So there's a lot of long-term logistical things that, while it's well and truly away, the time's away from here, she needs to know roughly where she needs to be. So what part of the States or Alaska does she have to get all these things done with Wombat? And she did mention after the interview that it's actually quite an expensive process, but she obviously wants to bring him back. She mentioned learning Spanish and... she's been in South America now for a couple of years, and while she's obviously picking up the words here and there, it's amazing. For a lot of people in South America, they will often speak English, and you tend to get lazy because they'll speak to you because their English is probably better than your Spanish. But she's obviously deciding that she wants to learn Spanish and just to help her on the next leg of the trip, at least until she gets through Mexico. Yeah,
and I think it sounds like a really surely after all this time, she'd be good enough in terms of her Spanish to be able to communicate. But I mean, the thing that we found when we're travelling in South America is that from country to country, the variations in Spanish, the speed and the intonation changes. And there are a couple of times when, we left one country, Peru in particular, thinking how fantastic we were, being able to speak Spanish and engage with the locals. At least maybe they were too polite to say anything, I don't know. And then, you end up in somewhere like Bolivia, and it just doesn't cut it.
No,
you cannot communicate.
It's almost a totally different language, and it's like, okay, well, that's fine. We'll go from here. Now, she mentioned that she's going to be heading off to Colombia soon. I think she was saying it's going to be roughly about the end of the first week in March, and that will take her through till around about the end of May. And the plan is to keep on going at least until July, when she's meeting friends along the way, and then aiming to be in Mexico City by Christmas. So that will pretty much clear her out of through Central America, including Mexico, and then on to the Pacific Crest Trail in 2021. Now, what she was saying about the Pacific Crest Trail is, even though that's the trail she will work with, she's there to do the bigger trip, and it may be that she will get off that trail from time to time, because there are sections of the Pacific Crest Trail where you cannot take dogs, and rather than trying to do something with Wombat, she'll just take a different route, get out of the national parks where she needs to, and then come back onto the trail. So it's not going to be, she was saying that it's not going to be a purist journey of the Pacific Crest Trail. It's really about the larger trip overall is what she's focusing on.
Yeah, and also she doesn't, she's obviously very attached to Wombat and doesn't want to leave him somewhere and pick him up again. And he's great company. She's talked about previously how he's good protection for her too. So yeah, I can understand why she would prefer to do that and not take the purest route, as you put it.
And you would have heard Wombat barking throughout that.
Play with me.
That episode. That's apparently he was outside barking at the other dogs. Now, she had actually picked up another dog, and this was by sheer accident. This dog had adopted her. And I think this is often the case when you get stray dogs. As soon as you show them a bit of kindness, they don't let you go. And so this dog was obviously waiting for her at the end of the day and followed her back to her place. And I did ask her about whether she was going to take this other dog with her when she goes, and she said as much as she'd love to, the cost of getting Wombat back to Australia was prohibitive, let alone a second dog. And she said, thankfully, the people she's staying with in Ecuador have fallen in love with this dog, and they're going to be keeping this dog. So it'll be happy and fed from there. So I think overall, the highlights that she mentioned were things like the scenery overall, including the volcanoes. As Jill said, being in the middle of nowhere and being recognised. So it's I know from time to time I'll be doing a random hike and someone will recognise who I am. And it is, even though you're on social media, it is still a bit of a surprise, and you do tend to appreciate it. And she mentioned crossing the equator. Yeah. And again, I tended not to think about that at all. I knew that it was roughly there somewhere, but she's saying she's just almost done about 10,000 kilometres. So she still has a way to go yet. But she sounds like she's picking up pace.
Yeah, and it's great, and that crossing the equator must have been such a joy, such a exciting thing to do, because you'd be constantly looking for those milestones along the way. More than 10,000 kilometres crossing the equator. Counting the countries as you go, that sort of stuff. That'd be definitely the stuff that would keep me going.
Okay, so we hope you've enjoyed this catch-up with the Lucy and Wombat as they continue their journey north on the length of the world. We will catch up with her again at least once or twice later this year, and we'll continue to follow along with Lucy as she goes through her trip. In next week's episode 142, we're going to be discussing what to pack for a day hike. So keep an eye out for that. One final thing just to finish off, just to help promote these podcasts with Lucy, as well as the Australian Hiker podcast in general. Let your friends know who might be interested in even in Australian Hiker or in Lucy's journey overall. And to help get the message out there, give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, iTunes, or your podcast listener of choice. Okay, so that's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.
Thanks very much for listening. We hope you enjoy. That's all for me.
Bye from now.
Okay, try again.